April 12, 2025, 05:17 hours, South China Sea. Aboard the USS Ronald Reagan, alarms screamed across the Combat Information Center. The ship's Aegis system had just flagged 5 hypersonic missiles barreling toward the carrier at Mach 10. The threat wasn't theoretical anymore. It was screaming through the sky. These weren't test rounds. Intelligence soon confirmed the worst. Chinese YJ-21 carrier killer missiles launched from H-6 bombers and mobile land platforms off Hainan Island. This was a preemptive strike. Deliberate, coordinated, and high risk. The Reagan had just minutes to respond. Every sailor on board froze for a second, but only a second. CIC officers scrambled to redirect interceptors. Sea Sparrow batteries whirred to life. The electronic warfare suite fought to jam the incoming lock, but the missiles were already too close. No margin, no delay. At 5:18, the first impact came. Steel buckled, systems failed. The Reagan, America's flagship in the region, was suddenly blind, burning, and drifting. The first missile struck with brutal clarity, slamming into the port side of the USS Ronald Reagan's flight deck near Catapult 3. The explosion vaporized radar domes, shattered launch rails, and sent a fireball across the bow. Internal systems detected a pressure spike that knocked sailors off their feet from the command bridge to the hangar deck. Emergency lighting flickered on as the main generators momentarily surged. Damage control teams rushed forward, but the fire spread fast. Aviation fuel was burning. Nearby, ordnance carts had been scattered, their loads now a deadly risk. A loaded FA-18 Hornet, moments from launch, was scorched and smoldering. The Reagan, America's floating fortress, was wounded. Just 20 seconds later, the second and third missiles arrived in coordinated succession. One struck amidships, tearing into the communications tower and disabling long-range radar and encrypted comms. The other hit near the aft elevator, cracking the hull and forcing part of the flight deck to collapse inward. Debris rained down into the hangar bay. The ship's close-in weapon systems, CIDUS, had engaged, bursting in a roar of 20mm tracers, but they were seconds too late. The missiles traveled at Mach 10 with minimal radar signature. ECM countermeasures failed. Clouds dispersed ineffectively. Sailors screamed into radios requesting medics and fire teams. Fires raged. The carrier's heart was losing rhythm. Then came the fourth and fifth impacts. One detonated underwater near the hull, likely a guidance failure or intentional targeting of the keel. The shockwave cracked internal bulkheads, triggered power rerouting alarms, and knocked out electrical systems in aft compartments. The last missile hit near the bow again, completing a deadly pincer. The Reagan was now blind, limping, and barely afloat. On the surrounding perimeter, the USS Halsey and USS Rafael Peralta, both Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, launched SM-6 interceptors and scrambled to intercept any follow-on threat. The command deck was thick with smoke and sweat. Helmets clattered, radios barked incomplete orders, and on every screen, one message pulsed red: multiple system failures. The Battle of the South China Sea had begun with shock and fire. Amid the chaos on the USS Ronald Reagan, Vice Admiral Connor Harlan issued a terse order over the command circuit. All escorts assume combat posture. Begin counterstrike pattern Charlie. The words crackled through damaged comms, but the fleet responded with urgency. The destroyers USS Halsey and USS Rafael Peralta activated their full Aegis combat suites. Within seconds, the SM-6 vertical launch cells opened with a hiss, unleashing interceptors toward the projected launch sites along the Chinese coastline. These weren't warning shots. The US was retaliating, fast and hard. On the deck of the Halsey, sailors braced as the ship's radar acquired new contacts, multiple bombers retreating west, likely the H-6K platforms that had launched the YJ-21s. Their radar signatures were faint, masked by land clutter and electronic jamming, but trackable. "We've got egress vectors," the officer confirmed. The Rafael Peralta redirected its fire control radar, locking on to the edge of Hainan's missile belt. 2 Tomahawk cruise missiles launched from her bow, silent, low, and fast. Their target, a known Chinese mobile missile launcher unit identified just hours before by satellite pass. The warhead was conventional, but the message wasn't. The U.S. strike group was not retreating. Back aboard the Reagan, damage control teams fought to restore partial radar coverage using surviving SPY-1D components. Forward sensor arrays were gone, but starboard modules gave intermittent contact with surface targets. From CIC, the bridge had eyes again, limited, but enough. Air defense coordination resumed with the carrier group. Then, a flash, distant on the eastern horizon. The first Tomahawk hit, then the second. Real-time satellite feed confirmed secondary explosions. A Chinese battery was burning, but the moment of relief was brief. A sonar ping echoed aboard the Halsey, followed by a chilling report. Multiple torpedo tracks bearing 240. Estimated speed, high. Depth, shallow. Beneath the rolling waves, the threat was now invisible. Two Chinese Type 093 nuclear-powered attack submarines had moved into striking distance during the initial missile salvo. Their launch of heavyweight U-6 torpedoes was a textbook ambush, timed to exploit the chaos aboard the Reagan and force U.S. escorts to divide their defenses. The sonar team aboard the USS Halsey sprang into action. Within seconds, the ship initiated evasive maneuvers, deploying countermeasure canisters and shifting propulsion patterns to confuse the torpedo sensors. But these weren't legacy threats. The U-6 torpedo was fast, smart, and lethal. Aboard the Rafael Peralta, sonar confirmed dual torpedo tracks converging at 60 knots, angling toward the Reagan's starboard side. Torpedoes locked on carrier signature, the chief of sonar reported grimly. That meant one thing. The enemy intended to finish what the YJ-21 missiles had started. The Peralta's captain ordered immediate ASROC deployment, anti-submarine rockets armed with homing depth charges. Two launched, plunging into the sea and detonating in a calculated pattern designed to force any sub to break stealth or die trying. Moments later, one detonation triggered a sudden sonar spike. Screws, hull flex, cavitation. A hit, but there was no time to confirm the kill. The second torpedo was still closing. On the Reagan, the damage control effort was pushed to the limit. Crews near the starboard shaft line heard the rising whine of an inbound torpedo. Emergency flooding valves were shut. Anti-torpedo defenses, already partially degraded by the earlier strike, deployed a final decoy, a small self-propelled noisemaker designed to mimic the carrier's acoustic signature. It worked. The U-6 swerved violently, locking onto the decoy just seconds before impact. The explosion occurred 90 meters off the hull, close but survivable. Still, the shockwave fractured sensor mass and rattled the bulkheads loose. Inside the CIC, operators steadied themselves, blinking through smoke and red emergency lighting. Above deck, the sun had just begun to rise, but the battle below the waves was far from over. As the sea battle raged below, the skies above the South China Sea ignited. A swarm of Chinese drones launched from a forward operating base on the Paracel Islands entered the battle space. These were GJ-11 Sharp Sword stealth drones, low observable, autonomous, and programmed for anti-ship missions. They flew low, skimming wave tops, masked from radar by both stealth coating and the residual electromagnetic chaos of the previous strikes. On board the USS Halsey, the radar operator caught their signature only at the last moment. Multiple low-level fast movers, range 8 kilometers, closing fast. The alert went out. The ship's CIWS turrets spun, tracking targets. The Reagan, crippled but not dead, still had teeth. What remained of her electronic warfare suite sprang into action, broadcasting jamming pulses across the surface wavebands. The drones, relying on encrypted comlinks and onboard sensors, struggled to navigate the interference. Some veered off course, others corrected and pressed in. Two drones closed within striking distance of the Reagan's starboard quarter. One released a precision-guided munition, a small anti-radiation missile aimed at the last functioning radar emitter. It struck, knocking out the damaged array and plunging the carrier's sensor network back into darkness. The second drone was less lucky, intercepted mid-dive by a Sea Sparrow missile from the Halsey. It exploded in a shower of carbon and fuel, crashing into the sea. But the swarm wasn't done. More than a dozen drones were still maneuvering through the battle space, probing weaknesses, triangulating signals, and targeting emitters. The Rafael Peralta activated its full drone defense protocol. 30mm cannons opened up in sweeping arcs. Electronic countermeasures pulsed. The sea lit with orange flashes as drones detonated mid-air. But two slipped through, aiming for the Reagan's flight deck once more. They were intercepted not by missiles, but by sheer courage. Two FA-18 Hornet pilots, scrambled from the USS Halsey just minutes earlier, roared in at low altitude. Using cannon fire and wingman coordination, they clipped and destroyed both drones in the final seconds before impact. It was desperate, precise flying, the kind only seen in war, and it bought the Reagan time to breathe. Inside the damaged command deck of the USS Ronald Reagan, the atmosphere was thick with smoke, tension, and the hum of failing systems. Vice Admiral Harlan stood over the central tactical display, his uniform smudged with soot, one earpiece dangling. Below deck, sailors were still battling fire and flooding. 27 crew were unaccounted for. Power fluctuated. The carrier's propulsion was reduced to 30%, and half the elevators were offline. But in that moment, the Reagan still held position. Retreat was never discussed. We hold. We fight. We finish this, Harlan ordered. Around him, battered officers nodded. They were trained for moments like this. A triage bay was set up in the hangar where the medical team worked through smoke and the scent of burning insulation. Sailors arrived with burns, shrapnel wounds, and shell shock. Some were carried on stretchers made from ripped fuselage panels. Above them, the flight deck had become a patchwork of scars, sections still smoldering, munitions scattered, safety netting torn. And yet, amid the wreckage, the deck crew prepped two aircraft for launch. One was a Hawkeye surveillance plane, its radar dish damaged but partially functional. The other, a Super Hornet armed with air-to-surface precision weapons. They weren't launching a counteroffensive, they were launching survival. Meanwhile, coordination among the strike group intensified. The USS Halsey detected new electromagnetic signals, possible missile targeting radars reactivating from Chinese coastal batteries. The Rafael Peralta redirected its SPY-1D radar westward and locked onto what appeared to be mobile command vehicles on Hainan. Debates on escalation echoed across encrypted lines to the Pentagon. Rules of engagement had already been stretched thin. But on board the Reagan, the equation was simpler. Defend the ship, protect the crew, disable the threat. At 5:41 a.m., the Reagan's deck catapult hissed to life. The Super Hornet roared into the sky, its pilot radioing a single phrase, "Package outbound." The battered carrier had just launched its next move. The Super Hornet, call sign Viper 1, flew low and fast, cutting through the morning haze at 500 knots. Its mission was not to win the war, but to stop the bleeding. Guided by partial radar data from the Hawkeye, Viper 1 navigated toward the suspected launch corridor used by Chinese bombers and missile units. With the Reagan disabled and satellites disrupted by jamming, the pilot was flying through uncertainty. Below, the ocean reflected fire and steel. Above, the sky was deceptively calm. Then the coordinates came through, a mobile radar and missile system repositioning north of Hainan. Viper 1 armed its JDAMs. There would be no second pass. At the same moment, a fresh wave of cruise missiles appeared on the Halsey's radar, inbound from the Western Arc. These were different, slower, smaller, and likely meant for saturation. CIDUS and ESSM systems kicked in across the strike group. Dozens of interceptors launched. Some missiles broke through. One struck the aft section of the Rafael Peralta, damaging her helicopter deck. Another crashed into the sea, meters from the Reagan, but the majority were intercepted midair. Even so, the intent was clear. China wasn't done. It was a final pressure test, a message, but the US had one of its own. Viper 1 released its payload. Two JDAMs fell fast and silent, guided by inertia and memory. The impact lit the coastline with two thunderous flashes, followed by secondary explosion. A munitions truck, a radar dome, and several vehicles were engulfed. Satellite imagery briefly restored confirmed critical damage to the mobile launcher unit. The Reagan's bridge received the transmission with grim silence. No cheering, just cold confirmation. The pilot of Viper 1 turned south, low on fuel, heading back to a crippled carrier still floating because its crew refused to surrender. The skies were quiet again, but no one aboard the Reagan believed this was the end. The USS Ronald Reagan did not sink, but it came close, too close. 5 missiles, torpedoes, drone strikes, and wave after wave of saturation attacks turned the carrier into a wounded monument to resilience. Her crew, bruised, burned, and exhausted, never abandoned post. Destroyers shielded her. Pilots flew defense through smoke. And when retaliation was ordered, it came not in anger, but with precision. But the cost was more than steel and fuel. It was the confirmation that modern naval warfare now moves faster than decisions, that missiles travel farther than politics, that drone swarms, stealth submarines, and coordinated saturation strikes can bring a billion-dollar carrier group to the edge. The Battle of the South China Sea was not the beginning of war. It was a test, one that ended with a warning from both sides, spoken not in words but in tonnage and blood. The Reagan limped home weeks later. She would be repaired, recommissioned, and redeployed, but no sailor aboard her that morning would forget the minutes between 5:17 and 5:48. The alarms, the silence, the fire. If you believe stories like this matter, and that we must understand modern war before it happens again, subscribe, like, and comment to support the channel.